Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a place where shadows linger a little longer than usual. So, if you're listening with the lights dim, maybe tucked under a blanket, that's perfect. You're in the right place. Now, you might think we're about to explore another chapter of medieval kings making terrible marriage choices, or yet another fragile dynasty collapsing under the weight of its own inbreeding. And don't worry, we'll get there eventually. But tonight, we're starting with something a little stranger. We're talking about the Pale Man. Yes, that Pale Man, the unsettling creature from Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, with his eyes in the palms of his hands, sitting silently in front of a banquet table he never eats from. And of course, we'll talk about why visitors, curious, foolish visitors, keep wandering into his dining room. Now, I know what you're thinking. This isn't exactly a royal scandal or a neat little slice of dynastic collapse. But the Pale Man is steeped in historical imagery, folklore, and the very same anxieties that haunted medieval Europe. The figure didn't just appear from nowhere. He's stitched together from centuries of our cultural nightmares: famine, greed, the strange, uncomfortable relationship between power and appetite. So tonight, we'll drift into that imagery. We'll wander slowly through the Pale Man's banquet hall, and along the way we'll bump into the things he represents. Ancient kings who starved their own people, nobles who had more feasts than they had sense, and the endless cycle of humans who sat down at richly laid tables but somehow still left hungry. Because that's the irony of the Pale Man. He doesn't eat. He just sits there, pale and skeletal, at a banquet he never touches. And yet he devours visitors the moment they taste even a crumb of his food. It's the kind of metaphor that medieval monks would have loved. Rich, moralistic, and a little bit terrifying. But don't worry, we're not here for terror. We're here to let the strangeness wash over us like a bedtime story that got slightly out of hand. So let's begin. The Pale Man is, of course, fictional, but his hall, his table, his strange rules, they feel old, and in a sense they are. The imagery comes straight out of medieval manuscripts, fairy tales, and the broader European obsession with hunger. You see, famine was the great background noise of medieval life. Crops failed, winters were long, and people never stopped talking about food, usually in the sense that they didn't have enough of it. For peasants, hunger was constant. For nobles, feasting was constant. And naturally, the contrast between the two produced The Pale Man is basically an exemplum that got a Guillermo del Toro makeover. And like most exempla, it comes back to kings. Kings who ate too much, kings who hoarded food, kings who died of gout because they couldn't stop gnawing on roasted swans while their peasants were chewing bark. One of my personal favorites, if favorite is the right word for this, is Charles IV of France. He was nicknamed the Fair, not because of his appearance, mind you, since he reportedly looked like a slightly wilted cabbage, but because fair was a fashionable nickname for Capetian kings at the time. Charles reigned in the early 1300s, right around the time Europe was sliding into the Great Famine. And what did Charles do while people were starving? He held banquets, naturally. He sat in Paris surrounded by food, while entire villages were abandoning their fields, their animals, and sometimes their children. That is the Pale Man in real life, a monarch sitting in front of food he doesn't share, while visitors to his hall are quietly destroyed. But the Pale Man isn't just about famine. He's also about fear. And medieval Europe had plenty of that. Take the monstrous races of medieval lore. Strange people with dog heads, or feet so large they could be used as umbrellas. They filled the margins of manuscripts. They weren't real, of course, but they represented something. The others who existed at the edge of human society. The people you might stumble across if you wandered too far from the castle walls. The Pale Man feels like one of those, an unsettling figure who isn't exactly human, but not quite monstrous either. He just sits, waiting, silent. That silence is key. Monsters in medieval stories usually roared or rampaged, but the Pale Man, he just waits. He doesn't have to chase you. He doesn't need to scream. You'll betray yourself by touching what you shouldn't. And then, calmly, he'll consume you. If you think about it long enough, he starts to resemble history's more ineffective kings. The ones who didn't actively destroy their kingdoms, but simply sat still, staring blankly, while everything collapsed around them. Think of Richard II of England, who loved pageantry and feasts, but couldn't quite manage basic governance. Or Louis XV of France, who watched the revolution roll toward him as if it were a curious parade, and then wondered why everyone was so upset. Both of them were pale men in their own way. Pale because they were fragile, ill-prepared, and vaguely sickly. Men because they sat at banquet tables while events spiraled out of their control. Now, you might ask, why visitors? Why do people keep wandering into the Pale Man's hall? Surely, if you see a gaunt figure with eyes in his hands, you leave immediately. But no, visitors always come. And that, too, is history. People always approach the banquet table. They always thought they could take a little more from kings, or slip past authority, or test the limits of what was forbidden. Peasants stole food. Nobles plotted against monarchs. Court rivals sneaked into private chambers. Humans are curious, and curiosity usually puts them directly in the Pale Man's path. It's a soft, cautionary truth. We wander. And sometimes, wandering leads us straight into a monster's dining room. So tonight, as we drift deeper into this story, we'll follow the visitors. We'll think about the real historical figures who resemble the Pale Man, not because they had eyes in their hands, but because they sat in silence, wasting what others needed, and punished anyone who reached for it. And then, gently, we'll see how those figures shaped history, often for the worse. But for now, let's just linger in the hall. The food is on the table. The Pale Man is still waiting, and we are only just beginning. So, let's drift a little deeper. We've lingered in the pale man's hall long enough to get comfortable with his silence. Now let's turn our eyes to the real world, and the very real kings who could have walked straight out of that room. Because you see, the pale man may be fictional, but history gave us more than enough human versions of him. Men so pale, so sickly, so strangely unsettling that even their courtiers were a little unnerved. The kind of royals who looked like they'd been drawn by an artist with a very limited palette, mostly shades of parchment and candle wax. The first that comes to mind, and perhaps the most famous, is Charles II of Spain. If the pale man had a passport, it would probably bear Charles's portrait. Charles was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. Born in 1661, he was the unfortunate result of way too much family togetherness. You know the Habsburg chin? That unfortunate jawline that stuck out so far it could practically serve as a small shelf? Charles didn't just inherit it. He was the poster child for it. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a particularly messy wreath. Generations of cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces. It was like the family refused to admit that anyone else in Europe existed. By the time Charles was born, the genetic dice had been rolled so many times that they weren't dice anymore. They were just oddly shaped lumps with no winning numbers. The result? Charles II was a living example of why royal inbreeding makes historians sigh. His lower jaw jutted so far forward that he couldn't properly chew food. His tongue was so large it made speaking difficult. He had trouble walking, learning, even digesting. Contemporary doctors described him, somewhat unkindly but not inaccurately, as more of a corpse than a man, which you'll notice is very close to the pale man's aesthetic. But here's the thing. Charles was still king, which meant people still bowed, courtiers still flattered, and the kingdom still had to stumble along under his reign. And stumble it did. Spain under Charles II drifted toward ruin. The empire was crumbling abroad, and at home the monarchy could barely function. Ministers squabbled, court factions schemed, and Charles himself mostly sat there. Much like the pale man at his feast, Charles was surrounded by the trappings of power, but unable to make much use of them. Food was on the table, but he couldn't eat it. Power was in his hands, but he couldn't quite grasp it. He lingered, silent, unsettling, pale. And eventually, visitors to his hall, in this case foreign monarchs, devoured what was left of Spain's influence. When Charles died in 1700, he left no heir. His body, according to legend, was so bloated and misshapen that autopsies recorded a head full of water, a heart the size of a peppercorn, and intestines rotten. It's hard to know how much of that was true and how much was invented by gossipy physicians, but either way, Charles became a symbol. A man too pale, too fragile, and too surrounded by ghosts of feasts he couldn't touch. In short, the pale man in royal flesh. Let's drift to another. If Charles II was the pale man of Spain, then Edward VI of England was his pale cousin across the channel. Edward was the longed-for son of Henry VIII, born in 1537, after Henry had already torn through 2 wives, a church schism, and half of England's monasteries to secure a male heir. You'd think this miraculous child would grow into the sturdy warrior prince Henry dreamed of. Instead, Edward was small, sickly, and pale. The sort of boy who looked like he'd rather stay indoors with a cup of warm milk than lead an army into France. Edward became king at just 9 years old, which you'll notice is far too young to do much of anything except collect wooden toys and occasional fevers. While regents ran the country, Edward busied himself with theology, writing sermons that sounded like the diary entries of a very earnest but slightly gloomy child. He lasted just 6 years on the throne. Tuberculosis, or something very close to it, consumed him. By 15, Edward was gone, leaving behind a kingdom once again plunged into succession crises. He was, in many ways, another version of the Pale Man. Pale in appearance, pale in strength, pale in legacy. He sat at a banquet table he could never fully enjoy. His reign was more a shadow than a meal, a faint figure presiding over a hall of schemers and visitors waiting to consume the leftovers. And then, of course, we have Ivan the Terrible of Russia. Now, Ivan was not pale in the sense of fragility. He was pale in the sense of being slightly too intense for human comfort. He had those sunken eyes, that gaunt face, that air of someone who hadn't eaten in weeks but was still fueled by pure paranoia. Ivan loved pageantry and ritual. He adored feasts and ceremonies, but always with an edge of cruelty. His infamous oprichnina, his private police, turned banquets into scenes of terror. Guests never knew whether they'd be feasting or facing execution, which again feels very Pale Man, a table laid with food, but a trap waiting for anyone foolish enough to taste it. Ivan lived long enough to become more legend than man. Stories paint him as wandering Moscow dressed as a monk, muttering prayers while plotting torture. The kind of figure who sits in silence, then suddenly lashes out at anyone daring to move too close. In other words, another visitor enters the hall and doesn't leave. But perhaps my favorite Pale Man parallel isn't a king at all. It's Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king after Charles II's messy exit. Philip was supposed to revitalize the monarchy. Instead, he slid into what we might politely call existential despair. Philip suffered from severe depression. At times, he refused to leave his room. He stopped cutting his hair, trimming his nails, or even changing his clothes. He sat pale, silent, gaunt, as ministers tried to coax him into ruling. When courtiers begged him to eat, he refused. When they asked him to sign documents, he waved them away. He became, quite literally, a living ghost in the palace. And yet, there he sat, the King of Spain. His visitors kept coming, hoping for decisions, favors, leadership. Instead, they found a Pale Man at the head of the table, unable to touch the feast of power before him. So you see, history gave us more pale men than we know what to do with. Some were pale because of inbreeding, some because of illness, some because of the sheer weight of their own unhappiness. But all of them sat in those banquet halls, surrounded by food they couldn't eat, watched by visitors who dared too much. And slowly, quietly, their kingdoms were devoured instead.